Dear market, please take care of my friends, my family, loved ones. Particularly take care of the elderly. Also, could you please look after my transport, my food, housing, healthcare? I know I've sinned this year, but I'd be really grateful if you could also look after the outbreak of a new virus, which is asymptomatic for 40% of the population. Imagine if every last aspect of human society was the remit of this thing, which most people don't understand is an entirely human construct, and yet is apparently all-knowing and all-powerful. If you described it a century ago, people would have called it God. Most people these days just call it the market. The default ideology of the last 40 years is something called neoliberalism. That's the academic word, but in everyday terms it means the market always knows best. It's kind of a secular way of saying God willing in an age dominated by public and rational choice theory. Will we have good fruit this summer? Market willing. Should we build a new library in town? Well, let's all go consult the market oracle. Alas, no. The oracle says letting kids borrow books for free isn't possible, I'm afraid. Let's have 4 pret-a-mangers on one high street instead. That's a much more rational allocation of resources.
I'm afraid I'm the kind of guy who spends his time going to pret-a-manger.
Now, of course, not everything is subordinated to this logic. Market economics might make your phone or your razor blades, but for essentials, we've generally decided to not be so market supremacist. It's generally agreed that whether you die from cancer or not shouldn't depend on your ability to pay, unless of course you live in the United States. It's similar when it comes to things like primary and secondary education, or your ability to use a pavement, or calling the police in the event of an emergency. Now, market supremacists, the people who want the logic of markets applied to as many things as possible. This might sound kind of weird, but there are actually quite a few people who actually think like this. Economists like Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek, James Buchanan. And then there are the politicians they subsequently influenced to varying degrees, which basically includes every prime minister and president on both sides of the Atlantic since 1980. That's before we get to Ayn Rand, the libertarian novelist who Sajid Javid reads to his wife every year.
My terms are a man's right to exist for his own sake.
Ayn Rand believed that any form of government benefit was evil and yet claimed social security payments before she died. Imagine this. It's 1940. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany in Europe. Messerschmitts and Stukas dominate the sky. Blitzkrieg warfare is inflicting pandemonium on Belgium and Poland. France falls in weeks. Confronted with all of this, the British ruling class decide to act decisively and leave it to the market. I mean, why shouldn't they? After all, they say the market's always right. It leads to optimal outcomes, perfect equilibria. Any disruption at all is negative. There are highly influential economists who actually think like this. They effectively designed the economic policies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. One of them was Alan Greenspan. He was the chairman of the US Federal Reserve when the global financial system crashed in 2008, something which, until then, he thought was impossible.
I still do not fully understand why it happened.
During the 2008 financial crisis, hundreds of billions of dollars were poured into banks around the world by central governments, from Britain to the US, South Korea to Russia. They were taken into public ownership and recapitalized, all to keep the system on life support. It was free market capitalism and nothing else, until that system broke down. Then we had socialism for financial services, paid for by the rest of us.
It would have been the end of our economic system and our political system as we know it.
Now there's the coronavirus. It's a big deal. At the time of this video, there are around 111,000 known cases, with around 3,890 deaths. That's approaching a 4% fatality rate, but that would be a misreading because actually a significant number of people show no symptoms at all, while others show some symptoms but they're indistinguishable from a cold or the flu, which means we don't really know how many people have the disease or, more importantly, who might transmit it. In this context, self-isolation likely won't be very effective. So it's quite possible that many people get this. Indeed, Harvard epidemiology professor Mark Lipsitch recently stated that the likely outcome is that it ultimately won't be containable.
This will transmit in a global fashion and take a big toll on essentially the entire globe.
He predicts that within the coming year, some 40 to 70% of people around the world will be infected with the virus that causes COVID-19. But he clarifies emphatically, this does not mean we will all be subject to severe illnesses. it's likely that many will have mild disease or may be asymptomatic. But still, for a significant minority, the consequences are horrible, even deadly. Cold and flu season might become cold, flu and COVID-19 season. That is, until a vaccine is created. And if this is the case, we clearly need to create a sustained state-led response, just like we've seen in China. But if you believe in market economics, then why should the state do anything at all? After all, doesn't the market always know best? Well, every senior politician in Europe and North America knows when push comes to shove, that isn't really true. But it's also the officially sanctioned ideology, which means they're caught in this weird middle ground between the Chinese state, who deploy massive state resources at speed, and the official neoliberal ideology of leave it to the market and don't forget to wash your hands. In Britain, that sounds something like this.
That's where a lot of the debate has been. And one of the theories is that, perhaps you could sort of take it on the chin.
And in America, it looks something like this.
So I think we're in great shape. I think we're in great shape.
If coronavirus is as bad as we think it might be, that the market will sort it approach, like Carillion and Northern Rail, will lead to collapse. Except in this instance, it won't be an outsourcing company or a rail operator that has problems, but us, with large numbers of fatalities and the comparatively minor side issue of a global economic recession. By the way, it was only a month ago that coronavirus was being treated in a similar way in Italy. Now the Italian government is adopting decisive measures which are unthinkable under neoliberal ideology. Quarantining an entire country and suspending mortgage payments is as unfathomable as capital controls or nationalising food supplies. But here's the thing, this is a crisis, there is a problem, and it needs a solution. The state has to act accordingly. Now, will the vanguard of the 1970s neoliberal revolution, Britain and America, deliver the goods? That remains to be seen. And when it comes to healthcare, it's not just coronavirus where neoliberalism is inadequate. Not a single new antibiotic has been created for 35 years by private pharmaceutical companies, otherwise called Big Pharma. 35 years! The market isn't innovating when it comes to healthcare, at the very moment we need it the most. At the start of the 20th century, the leading causes of death were infection-related, but now they're age-related. This is a sign of success and something which we thought was permanent, but now they're running out. The development of antibiotics has not kept pace with microbial evolution. After a golden age of innovation between the 1930s and 1970s, when the state played a central role in the economy, the 1980s saw global investment in antibiotic research plummet. Why? Lack of profit. Because no matter how deadly, dealing with infections just isn't profitable. Big Pharma favours treatments that they can give to as many people as possible for as long as possible. Two things you don't have with antibiotics. For market fanatics, that means that drugs which are hugely necessary just shouldn't be made. The reason being, they don't make money. But the consequences of that thinking could be deadly. An infection might start killing people as effectively as it did in the early 1900s, when flu, measles, cholera, typhus were the biggest killers rather than stroke, cancer and heart disease. The coronavirus, as with the 2008 financial crisis, reveals our economic system for what it really is, a religion. The thing is, whether it's climate change, demographic aging and now a viral pandemic, the market doesn't really have the answers. It's holding us back and it certainly can't help us. The failure of an outsourcing company or trains running late, most of us can accept. But hundreds of thousands of people dying, I'm not so sure. If you like this video, why don't you like us on Facebook, on Twitter, maybe give the video a share. And if you're watching on YouTube, why not hit the like button and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Most important of all, please, 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 wash your hands. 20 seconds. Boris is a twat. How many times do you have to say Boris is a twat? 10 times? Okay.